Good evening and welcome. Tonight we are going to be flipping through this book about Canada. We're going to look at all the pictures and read all the little boxes. Now, this book has a lot of little boxes, so let's just dive right in. Let's get into it. Look at this bird. Let's see. Slide down the sled there on the snowy hill. We are playing at the Calgary Stampede Big Fair. These rides are really fun. There's a sweet little harp seal, little baby seal. A protest here against fracking. Clean water's better than dirty oil. And doing that fun light thing, if you have the right kind of camera, you can make words with your little sparklers. It's probably on Canada Day. Yep, Canada Day celebration. The beautiful, beautiful scenery of Canada. This is in Banff National Park. The beautiful northern lights. And this is in Newfoundland. Very quaint. A big old moosey moose. And this is in New Brunswick. These are potatoes growing. There's Toronto, the lake there, and the CN Tower. And this is in Saskatchewan, big cattle rancher there. And we have the skyline of Vancouver. Now here's our first box. It says, a new name for an old territory. In 1999, the map of Canada changed. The territory of Nunavut was created as part of a treaty settlement between the native Inuit people and the Canadian government. The region, which includes 2/3 of the former Northwest Territories, is a vast expanse of 808,200 square miles, including the waters in Canada's far north, an area slightly larger than Mexico. It wasn't a period. It makes up about 1/5 of Canada, covering much of the northernmost region of the Canadian mainland and the many islands that make up the Canadian Arctic archipelago. The land is populated mostly by the indigenous Inuit people. They are hardy folks whose ancestors learned how to live in this harsh, frozen land more than 1,000 years ago. However, only about 32,000 people live in this vast space, making Nunavut one of the most sparsely populated places on Earth. Also, since there are few roads, and in most places no roads, connecting Nunavut to the rest of Canada, it is also one of the most remote. Nunavut means our land in Inuktitut, the Inuit language, and in their own land, the Inuit people govern themselves. The capital of Nunavut, formerly called Frobisher's Bay and now called Iqaluit, is located on Baffin Island, the largest island in Canada and the 5th largest island in the world. There's part of the canal that links all the Great Lakes to the St. Lawrence. I was going to say this is the St. Lawrence Seaway. Connecting it to the St. Lawrence Seaway, to the St. Lawrence River. This is the St. Lawrence Seaway. Let's read about the bears of Canada. 3 types of bears can be found in Canada. The most familiar is the black bear, which can be found almost anywhere in the country except in the extreme north. Black bears, which are sometimes brown in color, are good climbers. They are omnivores and will eat almost anything they can find. Vegetation forms a large part of their diet, especially berries and nuts in summer. Bears may become accustomed to scavenging for food in garbage dumps. This brings them into close contact with people. Black bears are normally shy animals, but those that have developed the habit of feeding on garbage sometimes become a nuisance and a danger to people. The grizzly bear is found in western Alberta, British Columbia, the Yukon, the Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. It is much larger than the black bear and has a characteristic hump over the shoulders, formed by the muscles of its forelegs. It gets its name from the light or grizzled fur on its head and shoulders. The grizzly is also omnivorous, often digging for roots, but it will prey on elk, moose, deer, and caribou as well. Polar bears inhabit the Arctic seacoast. They vary in color from almost pure white in winter to a yellow or golden color in summer and the fall. Their thick winter coats and a thick layer of fat under the skin protect them from the cold. They are more carnivorous than the grizzly or black bear, preying mostly on seals. Bears are so sweet. There's a big old Douglas fir tree growing super big. It's in British Columbia. And these are fireweed blooms in the Yukon Territory. Very pretty, isn't it? Here's a box about Niagara Falls. On the international border between Canada and the United States, where the Niagara River separates Ontario from New York State, is the most powerful waterfall in North America. Niagara Falls is a famous destination for tourists on both sides of the border, attracting millions each year. The falls are actually 3 waterfalls: the Horseshoe Falls, the American Falls, and the Bridal Veil Falls. Combined, they form the highest flow rate of any waterfall in the world. The border goes through them, and most of the Horseshoe Falls belong on the Canadian side. The other 2 falls are on the American side. The Horseshoe Falls are the largest of the 3, with a vertical drop of some 173 feet. Made of the Mist boats ferry tourists out to the base of the falls, a journey that requires passengers to don ponchos to protect them from the drenching mists. On both sides of the river, the cities of Niagara Falls, Ontario, and Niagara Falls, New York, cater to the tourist industry. The Rainbow Bridge connects the 2 cities. In 1901, an American named Annie Edson Taylor, age 63, went over the falls in a barrel as a publicity stunt and survived unhurt. Since then, other daredevils have tried, and some have died in similar attempts, which are of course illegal, but nevertheless continue. And here's a big musk ox, a big old chonker there. Here's a native person. It doesn't say what tribe they're a part of, what culture, but really beautiful headdress here. That's really neat. Here's a teepee. It's from the Micmac, it says. Here's a huge box about Vinland. Why did Leif Erikson's landing in North America go unheralded for centuries, leaving Columbus to be given the dubious credit for discovering America 500 years later? Archaeologists have proven that Vikings established a settlement on the northern tip of Newfoundland in today's village of L'Anse aux Meadows. There they identified the foundations of several Norse longhouses identical to those built in 11th century Iceland and Greenland. The archaeologists also found Viking artifacts, some of which indicated weaving and ironworking, activities which were not practiced by Native Americans until after 1500 CE. The most detailed information about the Vikings' visits to Vinland comes from 2 Norse sagas, the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red. These 2 sagas were passed on as oral histories for centuries before being written down. The problem is that the 2 sagas differ from one another in certain details, so they cannot be treated as historical documents as such. However, they do assert that the Norsemen, setting out from Greenland, made several sojourns to the coast of today's Canada. Leif Erikson named the places he and his men found there according to their attributes. An icy barren place he called Helluland, or flat stone land. A flat wooded spot somewhere farther south he named Mockland, or woodland. But it was the warmer wooded area that he named Vinland, or wineland, or possibly meadowland, that created the most interest. This land produced fine wine berries, he claimed. Some interpretations say wine grapes, but grapes don't grow in Newfoundland. The Norse made wine from many sorts of berries, and it's likely he meant blueberries or the similar bilberry, which is sometimes called a winberry. According to the sagas, Leif's brother Torvald led an expedition to Vinland in 1003 and spent 2 years there. Within another year or two, another Viking explorer, Thorfinn Karlsefni, set up a colony somewhere in Vinland. Archaeologists don't know if either of these settlements corresponds to the remains found at Lonzo Meadows. In any event, both the sagas and the archaeological remains agree that the Norsemen did not stay long in Finland and seemingly never returned. Word of the Vinland made it into some of the literature of Northern Europe by 1075 and was known to the King of Denmark in that same century, but the news apparently traveled no further. The short answer to why Leif Erikson was not credited with discovering a new continent is that nothing much came of his findings. They didn't change history and were eventually forgotten or came to be considered mere mythology. However, Columbus's landing centuries later on the island of Hispaniola had an immeasurable impact on the course of history. Here's a cool old map from 1730 showing what was then known of Canada. Let's see, the Treaty of Ghent. Let's see. Okay. Just deciding whose land is what. Let's read about the Hudson's Bay Company. The green, red, yellow, and blue stripes of the Bay Department Store are prominent in the shopping centers of many towns and cities in Canada. The department store is the modern format of a more than 300-year-old company. The Hudson's Bay Company, founded in 1670, is the oldest commercial corporation in North America and one of the oldest in the world. It played a very important role in the opening up of Canada, especially in the northern and western parts of the country. It was originally a fur trading company that had its base in Hudson's Bay in the north. From there, it exploited the interior of the continent. In 1670, King Charles II of England signed a royal charter granting the Governor and Company of Adventurers wide powers, including exclusive trading rights in the vast territory called Rupert's Land, where the rivers flowed into Hudson Bay. The company fought with the French for control of the fur trade until 1713, when France acknowledged England's claim to Hudson Bay in the Treaty of Utrecht. In 1821, the Hudson's Bay Company extended its monopoly to the west when it merged with its former rival, the Northwest Company. For almost 2 centuries, the company not only controlled the fur trade, but effectively ruled the land, being responsible for providing law and order and government in the region. When it sold Rupert's Land to Canada in 1870, the company retained much of the land on which it had its trading posts and large areas of the prairies. It became increasingly involved in real estate, at the same time doing much business with settlers through the trading posts it had retained. Pretty interesting, isn't it? Here's a box on the Métis of Manitoba. The Métis are a people created by the union of French and Scottish trappers with indigenous women. They were originally hunters and trackers who lived as a semi-nomadic way of life, hunting bison. But bison dwindled as the railroad opened up the west. Afraid that their rights might be ignored, the Métis, under their charismatic leader Louis Riel, revolted and forced the federal government to grant provincial status to Manitoba. Peace was restored for a while, but in 1885 the Métis rebelled again. This time they were crushed and Riel was executed. In 2003, an Ontario court ruled that the Métis in the province deserved the same rights as other Indigenous communities in Canada, and had been promised but not practiced in Section 35 of the 1982 Constitution Act. Here's another person in incredible native headdress and clothes at a powwow in Ottawa. And a box here asking, should Quebec be a separate nation? Over the years, some of the French-speaking people of Quebec have felt that their culture and language were diminished by the dominant English-speaking majority in Canada. Some thought the problem might be best solved by having Quebec secede or separate from Canada and become an independent country. This philosophy is embodied by the political party Parti Québécois, which was formed in 1968. The party is committed to a program of sovereignty association. That is, it espouses political independence from Canada while retaining some links such as common currency. Popular support for the Parti Québécois resulted in the party being swept to power in 1976 and again in 1981. Yet, in 1980, when asked in a province-wide referendum whether they would support sovereignty association negotiations with the rest of Canada, the people of Quebec said no. During the constitutional crisis of 1992, Canadians as a whole and the people of Quebec themselves rejected a new constitutional accord that had been put together by their political leaders. This raised the specter of separatism once again. However, in a 1995 referendum, the people of Quebec voted to remain a part of Canada. The separatist movement in Quebec has since faltered somewhat, but only time will tell if Canada remains intact. And there's supporters of Parti Québécois. There's Queen Victoria outside the Parliament building in Victoria, very appropriate. And there's a statue of Queen Elizabeth II. That's in Ottawa and Parliament Hill. Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Here's a picture of the House of Commons chamber. Do I want to read this box? Why not? Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Every Canadian has fundamental rights and freedoms that are guaranteed by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, as contained in the Constitution Act of 1982. And this is the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I was debating if I wanted to read the whole thing, but let's go for it. The Charter guarantees all Canadians freedom of religion, thought, belief, opinion, and expression, including freedom of the press, freedom of peaceful assembly, and freedom of association. It protects a Canadian citizen's mobility rights to live, work, and move to wherever he or she chooses, legal rights to life, liberty, and security, and equality rights, so that it is an offense to discriminate on the basis of race, origin, color, religion, gender, age, or disability. It recognizes English and French as the two official languages of Canada and guarantees minority language educational rights, that is, a person's right, if in an English or French-speaking minority, to be taught in his or her own language. It is important, however, to realize that the Charter expresses basic principles and that it may be difficult to determine a person's exact rights. It is therefore up to lawyers and judges to interpret Charter rights and freedoms in accordance with the law and with specific case circumstances. Very exciting stuff. Let's read about Aboriginal self-government. In 1982, because of problems caused by the Indian Act and increasing demands by the First Peoples for more power and better standard of living, a special committee on Aboriginal self-government was created. In 1983, the committee recommended that the government establish with the First Nations people a new relationship in which self-government was an essential element. Accordingly, the Canadian government has committed itself to seeing that the principle of self-government is entrenched in the Constitution. Discussions are held regularly on exactly how new laws can facilitate the transfer of a wide range of powers to the various Indigenous nations. The Canadian government states that self-government in Aboriginal communities helps the economies of those communities by increasing investor confidence, supporting economic partnerships. These benefits can help improve living conditions. Among other things, this new relationship led to the creation of the new territory of Nunavut in 1999. It's a really incredible statue here, too, of all these animals coming together. Now let's read about the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The Mountie in his scarlet coat is familiar to people around the world as an icon of Canada. The Mountie stands as a symbol of law and order and authority to all Canadians. When the Canadian government took over control of the vast territories under the Hudson's Bay Company, it realized that something would have to be done to prevent the western and northern wilderness from degenerating into the lawlessness that had accompanied much of the opening of the American West. In 1873, the Parliament passed an act that established a temporary police force for the territories. 150 recruits were sent that winter to Fort Garry in Manitoba, followed by another 150 later in spring. The new police force, named the Northwest Mounted Police, was organized along the lines of a cavalry regiment, armed with guns and dressed much like soldiers in scarlet tunics and blue trousers to stress their symbolic link with the British Army. The new force set up a network of police posts and patrolled the land, effectively curbing the lawlessness of adventurers, many of whom had come from the United States. When gold was discovered in the Klondike, the Northwest Mounted Police were immediately sent into the Yukon. Their presence ensured that the Klondike Gold Rush became the most orderly gold rush in history. By the early 20th century, Canadians had begun to realize that the mounted police were here to stay. The Canadian government decided in 1919 to expand the Royal Northwest Mounted Police, as it was then known, into a national police force. When the legislation took effect in 1920, the mounted police headquarters were moved from Regina and Ottawa, and they became known as the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and gradually took over policing duties all over the country. Today, the RCMP functions as an agency of the Ministry of Public Safety Canada. Its duties have expanded to include organized crime, terrorism, illicit drugs, economic crimes, and offenses that threaten the integrity of Canada's national borders. Officers of the RCMP wear a blue uniform today. The scarlet tunic worn by Mounties, as popularized in books and movies, is in fact worn only on special occasions. But whether in red or blue, uniformed Mounties are on-duty police officers. And then here is the Parliament building in Ottawa, the capital of Canada. It's a bunch of saws, chopping down some trees, old-fashioned style. Canola fields, isn't that a beautiful color? And working the lumber industry here, packing trees onto trucks. There's some salmon filling the waters here, ready to spawn. And the rolling hills of Chilton and Badlands in Ontario. That's really remarkable, isn't it? Wow, I thought that was like burlap or something. How cool. Let's read about the gold rush. In 1856, a gold prospector, James Houston, discovered a large amount of gold dust along the Fraser and Thompson rivers, which have their source in the Caribou Mountains of British Columbia. When news of Fraser gold spread south, about 25,000 miners from the United States, Latin America, and Hawaii rushed north. At the height of the Fraser Gold Rush, about 10,000 miners were spread out over a 200-mile area. Mining the Fraser was difficult. Melting snows engorged the river, and mining could not take place until August, when the river was at its summer low. In winter, the freezing cold and deep snows made mining dangerous and often impossible. In 1862, an even bigger gold rush began when hopeful adventurers, following the Fraser north, hit the jackpot at Williams Creek in the Caribou region. Many made a fortune and squandered it just as quickly, but the real benefits of the Fraser and Caribou gold rushes were the blossoming of the town of Victoria into a busy city and the opening up of the interior of British Columbia. In 1896, gold was discovered in the Klondike by a prospector, George Washington Carmack, and his two companions, Skookum Jim and Tagish Charlie. Oh boy. The Klondike was Canada's greatest gold rush. It lasted a few spectacular years from 1897 to 1900. During which $40 million in gold were mined in the area. Conditions were harsh. The frozen ground had to be thawed out with wood fires before it could be excavated and the gold-bearing rock recovered. But that did not stop gold fever from infecting the thousands who flocked to the Klondike. Dawson City grew into a boomtown. At the height of the rush, the city had a population of about 30,000 people. In 2011, there were only 1,319 residents. Crazy. Look at this old sign, gold dust bought and sold. There's a hydroelectric dam in Alberta. And protesters against, let's see, migrants' rights, labor, big government, not sure, but against the APC conference, but I don't know what that is. Oh, here's a big orca. And looks like he's doing some conservation work there. Checking up on this tree. Look at that, this is the Biosphere in Montreal. Isn't that an incredible building? Let's read about tracking endangered species. There are hundreds of animals and plant species at risk in Canada. The exact number varies according to which group is doing the assessment, from 345 species according to Environment Canada to 645 according to the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, or COSOWIC. In general, species are classified as being extinct, endangered, threatened, or extirpated, which means locally extinct in a region in which it used to live, but still in existence in other places. This can also mean the species is now extinct in Canada, but still in existence in other countries. Destruction of native habitat, excessive commercial fishing and hunting, and pollution are largely the factors that endanger species in Canada as elsewhere. Global warming is also beginning to have an effect. In 2002, the Government of Canada passed the Species at Risk Act, its first Endangered Species Act, so that environmentalists can better research, designate, and manage the threatened populations. COSWIC lists 18 species of endangered mammals in Canada, including 2 kinds of caribou, 3 kinds of badgers, a kangaroo rat, and others. It also includes marine mammals, listing 7 kinds of whales, including the Atlantic and Pacific populations of blue whales and right whales, 2 populations of beluga whales, and killer whales or orcas. It also lists endangered birds, including the northern bobwhite, the whooping crane, and the Eskimo curlew, and reptiles, including the leatherback and loggerhead sea turtles. Also amphibians, fishes, arthropods, mollusks, and varieties of plants. COSWIC assesses the risk of extinction for wildlife species based on an unusual process. It draws on science, but also Aboriginal traditional knowledge and community knowledge. Aboriginal traditional knowledge is the complex understanding that Aboriginal peoples have accumulated about wildlife species and their environment, incorporating aspects of culture, spirituality, and history. In a similar fashion, community knowledge relies on any particular group's observations on a species' condition in nature, ecological relationships, changes in distribution and abundance, as well as threats affecting the species. There's a big wind farm up here. It says in the Rocky Mountains. And here's a box about the United States-Canada Air Quality Agreement. In 1991, the United States and Canada entered into an agreement to address transboundary air pollution. That's pollution that crosses national boundaries on air currents. Pollutants released at one location can travel long distances, affecting air quality many miles away. Such pollutants, of course, do not stop at a country's borders. The United States-Canada Air Quality Agreement, or the AQA, paved the way for the 2 countries to cooperate on a variety of air quality issues, including acid rain, ozone, and particulate matter. Emissions from power plants, manufacturing, and waste disposal contribute to the air pollutants, which can cause serious health problems. In 2011, the United States and Canada marked the 20-year anniversary of the agreement. Canada's Environment Minister Peter Kent announced that the AQA had resulted in a 50% reduction in the emissions causing acid rain and a 1/3 reduction in emissions causing smog. These reductions have contributed to significant improvements in air quality on both sides of the border. That's great. There's a sweet little and a cute little Canada shirt. What beautiful color eyes. This is Petite Vallée in Quebec, a little town there. Let's read about immigration discrimination. Not everyone who came to Canada in the 19th century received an open arms welcome from Canadians, who were then mostly of English heritage. When the government was actively recruiting prospective immigrants, it had a scale of preferences based on the idea that certain ethnic groups would fit best into Canada's established community. British and American settlers were preferred, followed by French, Belgians, Dutch, Scandinavians, and Germans. Italians, Slavs, and Greeks were less desirable, followed by Asians and Africans. But preferred or not, people from other countries kept coming in the belief that they could have a better life in Canada. Many of the early immigrants gravitated to the cities rather than remain in the isolated countryside. They provided the labor needed in mines, lumber yards, and factories, and they worked on the railway, cleared land, and helped build settlements. Many Canadians did not take kindly to their presence, vital though it was. Racist immigration laws were passed and enforced. They included several anti-Chinese laws, which first imposed a head tax on every Chinese person entering the country. It culminated in the Chinese Immigration Act of 1923, which prohibited any more Chinese from entering Canada. That act stood for 24 years before it was repealed. Chinese immigrants who were already in Canada were denied citizenship rights and the right to vote. Now things are very different. Mindful of their checkered past, Canadians have enshrined within their society a broad framework of laws and policies, such as the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Human Rights Act, and the Multiculturalism Act. These ensure that all individuals, regardless of where they come from, have a right to equal opportunities within Canadian society. Today, Canada is one of the world's most tolerant and multicultural countries. Oh wow, this is at the Squamish Nation Powwow in Vancouver. Look at these ethnic costumes, so beautiful. Let's see what's next. They are in their canoe out here, enjoying the beautiful scenery. A couple getting married here, and some old people dancing. Let's read about healthcare. Canada's healthcare system is one of the country's greatest points of pride. It's designed to ensure that everyone receives medical treatment regardless of their ability to pay. The program is an interconnected system of 10 provincial and 3 territorial health insurance plans, which Canadians call Medicare. It is publicly funded, meaning it is financed through taxes. Many health services are free and delivered by private healthcare practitioners. People can choose their own doctors and be assured that their medical information is confidential. According to the Canada Health Act of 1984, the provinces and territories organize and finance their own health insurance plans. The federal government also contributes. People pay toward the plan, but the amount they pay varies according to their income level. For elective procedures that the system doesn't cover, people can choose to supplement their insurance or pay out of pocket. In general, the government pays for about 70% of Canadians' healthcare costs. In remote areas where there are no provincial or territorial services available, the federal government provides primary care and emergency services. It is also involved in the regulation of medicines, foods, and medical devices, consumer safety, the monitoring of disease, and disease prevention. The federal government also supports health research. Canadians overwhelmingly approve of their healthcare system. In 2008, a study found that 91% of Canadians prefer their healthcare system to that in the United States. Obviously. Nevertheless, Canadian healthcare program continues to evolve and change. The system faces challenges from financial constraints, the aging of the population, and the high cost of new technology. And here's a box about the Alaska Highway. Canada's first roads were built for military purposes. A prime example is the Alaska Highway, nicknamed the Alcan Highway. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii in 1941 made the U.S. government realize the vulnerability of Alaska's shipping lanes to an attack. An inland route to Canada was thus deemed a military necessity. In exchange for the right of way through Canada, the U.S. government paid for the construction of the highway. For 8 months in 1942, 11,000 American soldiers and thousands more Canadian and American civilians worked on the highway from both north and south. In 1946, when the war was over, the Canadian portion of the highway was turned over to the Canadian government. The Alaska Highway stretches 1,488 miles from Dawson's Creek, British Columbia, to Delta Junction near Fairbanks, Alaska. There's the sign when you start driving on it. The Alaska Highway. Isn't this pretty? This is in Montreal, Canada's largest church. My goodness. Let's see, there's a cross, or a grave, I should say, a big cross on the grave. It's for Jacques Cartier. Here's a box about the healing rituals of the first people. Intricately woven into the nature-based belief systems of the indigenous people were healing rituals. Knowledge of healing herbs and other natural medicines were passed along from generation to generation over the centuries. The shaman, or medicine man, was a powerful member of a community who had ancient knowledge of healing practices. The Ojibwe underwent a purification ritual, entering a sweat lodge where the scented vapors of an intensely hot herbal sauna cleansed their bodies and spirits. The Huron and Iroquois peoples had curing societies. The Iroquois False Face Curing Society used carved wooden masks that they believed possessed a spiritual force. Those forces gave special curative powers to those who wore the masks. Transformation masks used by the Pacific Coast peoples were worn during religious ceremonies to show their belief in the interconnectedness of people and animals. The masks opened and closed to reveal either a human or an animal face as the wearer pulled the strings. I think that's what this is. All the nations had their own ways, and Canadian Indigenous people still draw on much of this knowledge today. What the healing practices have in common is that they are holistic in approach. The mind, body, and spirit are all seen as parts of the individual, and one part cannot be treated without attention to the whole. Illness is considered a physical manifestation of spiritual, mental, emotional, and physical disease. Traditional healing might include a combination of spiritual ceremonies, music and dance, herbal medicines or animal remedies, and counseling, which might include the input of the tribal elders. The accumulated knowledge of the elders is considered a vital source of healing power. Jean de Brebeuf, it says, clearly some kind of missionary or clergyman. The spiritual mother of New France. Marie Guillard, born in 1599 in France, was only 19 years old when her husband died, leaving her with a young son. In 1620, she had a mystical vision which changed her life. She devoted herself to God, and in 1631 entered a convent and became an Ursuline nun. In another vision, she was inspired to go to New France to help establish the Catholic faith in the New World. She sailed to Quebec in 1639 and started a convent and school, the first school in Canada. Wow. Marie de l'Incarnation, or Marie of the Incarnation, as she was called, ministered to the French colonists and also to the indigenous children, often in their own languages, which she had learned. She created dictionaries in Algonquin and Iroquois, which had no written language system, and wrote books about Catholicism in those languages. She earned herself the title of Spiritual Mother of New France. Today, the Ursuline Monastery of Quebec is one of the national sites of Canada. Marie was beatified in 1980 by Pope John Paul II. In 2014, Pope Francis canonized her as a saint. The Anglican Church of Canada also celebrates her life and works with a feast day on April 30th. What a life, right? And let's read about this really terrible policy, which I'll talk more about because if you know, you know. Much more happened after this book came out about 10 years ago. The policy of kill the Indian and the child. The effort to force the Aboriginal people to assimilate went further than conversion to Christianity. When Canada became a nation in 1867, the new government wanted the Indigenous people to give up the old ways and assimilate into Canadian society. At the time, the thinking was that they would be better off by learning to be modern Canadian people. Native ways were thought to be just so much hocus pocus at best, and at worst, dangerous, barbarian, and uncivilized. To put an end to it, government threw the full force of its power against the ancestral religions and customs of the natives. I think there's a typo in there. The Indian Act of 1876 set out a legal framework for establishing government control over every aspect of native life. The legislation banned important tribal ceremonies, including the potlatch, the sun dance, and other rituals. Around the same time, the Canadian government created a system of residential schools for Indigenous children, and a similar program was underway in the United States. Young Native children were sent to boarding schools far from their communities. There they were educated in the language, religion, and customs of the white man. The schools were run by various churches. In 1920, under the Indian Act, it became mandatory for every Native child to attend a residential school and illegal for them to attend any other educational institution. The residential school system endured for most of the 20th century. It had a devastating effect on Indigenous families and on the individuals themselves. In 2008, Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper issued an official apology saying two primary objectives of the residential school system were to remove and isolate children from the influence of their homes, families, traditions, and cultures, and to assimilate them into the dominant culture. These objectives were based on the assumption Aboriginal cultures and spiritual beliefs were inferior and unequal. Indeed, some sought, as it was infamously said, to kill the Indian and the child. Today we recognize that this policy of assimilation was wrong, has caused great harm, and has no place in our country. And just a couple of years ago, because this book came out in 2014-ish, mass graves were found at the sites of these schools, and not just 20, 30, 40 children's bodies, but hundreds, 200, 300. Absolutely horrific, just a whole other level of just absolute horror that these poor children had to go through. Well, it makes me really sick to think about, but the Canadian government has been working hard to try to make this right, even though it happened, over 100 years ago. But, I mean, like it says, there were still people in these schools in the 20th century, so it's a big yikes, isn't it? Bonne fête du Canada. There's a chart here saying what we say in British English, Canadian English, and American English. I won't go through it all, but my favorite is that in British English you say macaroni cheese, in Canadian you say Kraft dinner, and in American it's mac and cheese. This is just so absolutely foreign to me. Because even, I suppose, mac and cheese that's not Kraft mac and cheese is still called Kraft dinner. How strange is that, right? Anyway, there's a stop sign saying arrêt, stop, in French. Here's a beautiful totem pole. Isn't that gorgeous? All those colors there. And this I hate. Okay, this is outside the National Gallery of Canada. This really terrifying spider sculpture. I've seen this in so many pictures. It makes my skin crawl. I hate it. Let's read about the totem poles. A heritage carved in wood. Totem poles are a distinctive sculptural art form in the Pacific Coast peoples, a tradition that dates back centuries. Back then, tribes including the Haida, Tlingit, and Tsimshian had no written language, but they had important information that they wanted to pass on through the generations. This they did by telling stories, a custom called oral tradition, and they recorded or illustrated those stories by making totem poles. Spirits first taught the people to carve their stories into tall tree trunks, the stories say. Western red cedar was often the tree of choice because its wood is straight, abundant, and easy to carve. The powerful animals and fierce faces are not just decorations, they are symbols which represent legendary ancestors. The killer whale, raven, wolf, grizzly, hawk, beaver, and thunderbird, a mythological creature, all have special significance. Some poles honored the dead, others celebrated a birth or wedding. A pole outside the house of an important or wealthy person displayed the proud family history for all to see. The symbolic meanings can differ from one tribe to the next, but they all celebrate the close and even mystical bond between the people and their natural environment. The figures on the poles aren't just any animals, they are creatures of the Pacific Coast region. The animals represent the land, life, and spirit of the people. The art of totem pole carving almost died out during the last century when the indigenous people were forced to give up the old ways. But today those attitudes have changed, and tribal craftsmen are happily reviving their culture using traditional methods and hand tools. When a pole is finished and ready to be raised, the people gather for a special ceremony of drumming, singing, and dancing. Very cool. Some more kind of artwork here. This is a comb with beautiful, beautiful carvings in it. Here is a painting of hunting salmon at Kettle Falls on the Columbia River, it's called. Really neat. This is Margaret Atwood, whom I think is best known for writing The Handmaid's Tale, in my opinion. Let's read about my favorite Canadian book, Anne of Green Gables. I'm obsessed. When a young orphan girl, Anne Shirley, arrives in Avonlea on Prince Edward Island, she is excited at the prospect of being adopted by the middle-aged brother and sister, Matthew and Marilla Cuthbert. They live in a farmhouse called Green Gables and had requested an orphan to help with the farm work. But Anne quickly discovers that a mistake has been made. The Cuthberts had requested a boy, and taciturn Marilla is determined to send back the talkative, red-headed child. That's the opening scene of Lucy Maud Montgomery's classic Anne of Green Gables. Published in 1908, the novel about the spunky, clever, and wildly imaginative girl was the first in a series of 6 Anne books. There's actually 8, but the last 2 are spoilers. But the first 6 are about Anne. They have been read by generations of fans worldwide and are still very popular today. Each year, tourists flock to Cavendish, PEI, the inspiration for the fictional town of Avonlea, to visit the real Green Gables farmhouse and nearby Avonlea theme park. Anne of Green Gables has been made into movies, TV series, a musical theater production, and was even adapted into Japanese anime. In fact, Anne is extraordinarily popular in Japan, where she is called Akage no Anne, or red-haired Anne. I'd love to go someday. Here's Drake, definitely one of the most famous Canadians around today. And there's Martin Short presenting at a Canadian award show. Hockey, my favorite sport. I love ice hockey. Not to play, but to watch. And let's read about passion for hockey. In Canada, hockey is more than a game. It has been called a unifying force in a country that is often split by politics and language. Hockey is a symbol of Canadian identity itself. The game was invented by a group of Canadian soldiers in Kingston, Ontario, on a winter day in 1855. To relieve the monotony of garrison duty, the soldiers tied blades to their boots and hit an old lacrosse ball using field hockey sticks. Today, watching a hockey game has almost become a ritual. Hockey Night in Canada is the country's longest-running TV program, first airing in 1952. Canadian teams such as the Montreal Canadiens, the Edmonton Oilers, the Toronto Maple Leafs, and the Vancouver Canucks, as well as U.S. teams such as the Chicago Blackhawks and Detroit Red Wings, are members of the NHL. In the NHL Hall of Fame, are Canadians Maurice Rocket Richard, Bobby Orr, Bobby Hull, and Wayne Gretzky, also known as the Great One. Gretzky played for the Edmonton Oilers and the Los Angeles Kings before retiring in 1999 and is considered the greatest hockey player of all time. Canadians learn to love hockey from a very early age. The moment school is out, bags are tossed aside and goalposts set up in the neighborhood cul-de-sac, where half a dozen kids or so clash with hockey sticks to put an old tennis ball into the net. In the winter, the game is played on a frozen pond, stream, or indoor ice rink. Canadian children often dream of becoming stars in the National Hockey League, or NHL. Parents devote hours of their time taking aspiring NHL players to and from games and practices. At the Vancouver Olympics in 2010, Canadians rejoiced when both the men's and the women's Olympic hockey teams won gold medals. And in 2014, at the Winter Olympics in Sochi, history repeated itself when the Canadian men's and women's teams once again brought home the gold. Some American football here. The Saskatchewan Roughriders playing the Edmonton Eskimos. I didn't know they had American football in Canada. And of course, skiing. Some Canada Day fireworks here. Very beautiful. And this is at the Calgary Stampede. A big, what we call in America, it's a rodeo. What's this? Oh, it's a veteran, looks like, carrying a flag on Remembrance Day. And here's a box about the potlatch. The potlatch was a type of festival held in Pacific Coast indigenous communities in which a chief invited people to a celebration of feasting, dancing, and gift-giving. Potlatches were held to mark rites of initiation, to mourn the dead, or to celebrate the investiture of a new chief. During the ceremonies, native ancestral spirits were invoked, usually in a mythological animal form. At the potlatch, which could last for days, the host chief presented gifts to his guests. The value of the gift corresponded directly to the guest's social ranking. The greater the prestige of the chief, the more wealth he distributed in gifts. When his guests held their own potlatches, they were expected to give even more lavishly, or they would be shamed. A chief who made himself poor by giving lavishly at a potlatch could count on having his wealth returned at subsequent potlatches, where he would be a guest. These festivals of gift-giving were not merely parties or religious rituals. They had political, religious, kinship, and economic implications for the extended communities. The potlatch was important in establishing the status, rank, and privileges of the people. However, in the 19th century, government officials in both Canada and the United States suspected the potlatch ceremonies of promoting non-Christian values. They thought the custom empowered the Indian people and undermined the authority of the federal government, so they banned the practice altogether. In so doing, the laws helped to destroy indigenous culture, which of course was the true goal. The ban was finally lifted in 1934 in the United States and in 1951 in Canada. Potlatches are once again being held today, but never on the same scale as in the past. And this is in Alberta. They're doing a dance at a powwow. Really, really neat. Food. Looks like we've got a tap here for some maple sap. Catching a big old fish out the little fishing hole. And this is Creton, a meat pate. Looks pretty good. I guess it says it's served on toast for breakfast. Yeah, I'd eat that. Let's read about maple syrup. I think this is our last box now. Yeah. Maple syrup. To some people, maple syrup is synonymous with Canada. After all, the maple leaf is on the nation's flag. Quebec is by far the world's leading producer of maple syrup, and Ontario makes it as well. Maple syrup is harvested in the early springtime when the days are warm and the nights are cold. This is the time when the sap of the maple tree rises from the roots and runs through the tree. The indigenous people of northeastern North America first figured out how to make syrup from sap and used it in their cooking. They in turn taught the Europeans, who added technological improvements to the collection and production methods. Mature maple trees are tapped by driving a spigot into the side of the tree. A bucket or plastic tube is attached to the spigot to collect the sap, which is sweet but thin. In order to make just a gallon of syrup, about 40 times more sap has to be collected. Another way of visualizing this is about 10 gallons of sap must be boiled down to make 1 quart of syrup. The maple tree sap is put in special containers and boiled until it becomes sufficiently thick. Sugaring off, as the boiling process is called, is a great social event. Children in particular love it because they get to enjoy a special treat called sugar on snow, chewy bits of toffee made by splashing some of the hot, thick maple syrup onto clean snow on the ground. There they go, putting little bits of syrup on there, and then you just munch it. Got a recipe for delicious poutine. Yum yum. And some Canadian butter tarts. Here's a big map of Canada. All the provinces and territories. And we're going to end it there for tonight because this has gone on way too long. I told you there were a lot of boxes. Thank you so much for watching. And if you enjoy this style of content, please consider subscribing because I do videos like this all the time, and I have a bunch of other videos that are the same format. So be sure to subscribe because you don't want to miss out when I make more of these. I hope you found this video relaxing and educational, and I hope that you have a good night. Good night. Good night. Bonne nuit.